I'm Bob Buer. I do, my day job is as a credit analyst. That means I talk to people who buy and sell bonds and hold them for investment purposes. I've been doing this for a couple of decades now. The people I talk to generally don't show up at these things. Who here is from the bond world? Aha. Oh, so we got one person there, so that's, or two actually. So that's an improvement. We're already about a 50% improvement over every other group like this that I've been to the last 5 years. Because generally the only person is Mike Wilkins. He left. So the thing about bond investors that is paramount is that our risks are asymmetric. We buy bonds at par, and they might go up a bit, they might go down a little bit, but we're always facing a possible loss of 100%. Without a corresponding potential increase in value of 100%. So that basically guides our view of the world, which I'm going to present now, if I've got the right, which is the one that does anybody know? Oh, here we are, okay. This is stolen from S&P, Moody's and Fitch have something similar. This is basically a well-developed model of how credit risks and ratings are derived. And it's basically a process of sorting risks into a couple of different buckets, basically business risk and financial risk. We've got a couple of examples of each, but actually the lists are much longer than that. And actually sometimes the categories can go back and forth across the two. But this is a tried and true method that people who work at rating agencies have used, including me. I was at Moody's for a number of years. And people who do bond stuff not at rating agencies, and we do the same thing because our job is basically to try to anticipate what the rating agencies are going to do, because that's how we make money. And this has actually been a fairly successful model for the last 3 or 4 decades. So your average bond manager, say, is usually a guy. He's got his, in England, he's probably got his BA in finance from Cass or Manchester, and then he's gone off and gotten his CFA, which means his mind is blissfully untouched by the notion of economic externalities. So he's sitting there, he's comfortable in the second quartile, and he's just kind of plodding along, but suddenly his world has gotten very messy because what's happened is he's starting to see lists like this, and he's being told that he needs to respond. He needs to tell the clients how his portfolio approach deals with these sorts of things. So we've got this actually comes out of a publication put out by the Fixed Income Working Group, I think that's the correct title, of the Principles of Responsible Investment. They put out a couple of publications. This is from 2013. They did an update in 2014, which looks frighteningly similar. Now, you're this bond manager, right? You're in your second quartile, and you're trying to figure out, well, what do I do with all this? Okay, I can track health and safety. I can track diversity. So generally, the response is the first thing they do, and because it's not clear why he's also uncertain as to why he's being asked to do this. Usually it's because his firm has signed up for the PRI without having a clue what that actually really entailed. And once they figured it out, then the managers start going, okay. So he looks at this, and of course he's trying to figure out what biocapacity even means. And I've been looking at this list, and I actually spent a couple of months last year looking at this list because I thought it encapsulated something kind of interesting about the whole ESG issue, which hasn't actually penetrated the fixed income world very strongly. The first thing RPM does, by the way, is he calls up equity research and says, what do you have on this? And we got lots of stuff. So they said, can you send it over? And they send it over, and it's, of course, all the screening stuff from MSCI. So he's now he's even more confused, and plus he's got information overload. So he's looking at this. And if he's sharp, i.e. like me, he's noticed that actually there's a couple of themes here. And the first theme is that practically everything under the social and governance buckets here, and actually some of the environmental stuff, really come down to one kind of risk, if we're talking about risk, and that's management risk. Is management doing its job? Is management staying out of legal trouble? Is it anticipating technological changes? Is it doing what you want management to be doing to steer a firm through the Scylla and Charybdis of the business world? So actually, that's basically one kind of risk. And if you've got trustworthy management who's actually doing this sort of thing, Volkswagen, then of course you're going to have some level of comfort that actually these are issues that are being dealt with. Now, from a bondholder's point of view also, the reason why this list may be important is because if my risks are asymmetric, the main thing I'm worried about is an unanticipated downgrade, because that's the thing that's going to lose me money and my client, which is probably some pension fund. So I'm going to be looking at this list and thinking, what here is going to possibly produce a downgrade? Now, human rights. Child labor is a gruesomely awful thing, but you know what? The dirty secret is that no one's going to get downgraded because of child labor. Sorry. Employer relations, on the other hand, it turns out that in the mining industry, monitoring how many employees a company kills every year is actually a reasonable metric to look at. And actually, that is the kind of thing that agencies will take into consideration in looking at whether or not management is actually doing the job it's supposed to be doing. Product responsibility and health and safety. I'm not quite sure, some of these are a little nebulous probably, but product responsibility is, are you not producing products that are going to kill people? Okay, because that's the kind of thing that certainly will produce a downgrade. So consumer relations, I don't know if we have litigation risk in here anywhere, but it should be. So that's basically one kind of risk. And my position here is that, that's basically what you want management to be doing, is paying attention to those things. However, if we look at the environmental side, it gets a little bit more complicated because we do have things like climate change. Now, I'd submit actually there's no such thing as climate change risk. It's actually a collection of half a dozen different kinds of risks, some of which are proceeding more rapidly than others. Biodiversity, well, that's actually a different animal entirely. That's not even a global warming kind of category. That's actually another kind of category entirely. So, biocapacity, ecosystem quality, air and water pollution is actually a management risk. Is management controlling those things? Understand that. So where I end up here is that we basically got three different kinds of risks that we're looking at in this domain. Operational risks, which just sounds a little bit snazzier than management risks, climate risks, and natural capital risks. So we've actually applied this to a number of sectors so far. It's like half the papers here. It's a work in progress. So how does this actually work? Well, if we just take environmental risks, for example, what are the risks here, particularly the risks that might potentially produce a downgrade? Well, regulatory compliance risks are critical here. And certainly, my own background is as an American, so I'm more familiar with the U.S. landscape here than others. But Obama's Clean Air Program is that's a regulatory compliance risk that you would expect management to be able to deal with or not. Other regulatory risks, fines. Whether or not the 6.5 billion euros that VW has reserved so far is going to be sufficient, but that's the bucket that would actually fall into. And certainly VW is case in point of litigation risk, but every single pharmaceutical company is going to be a similar kind of situation. And in fact, pharmaceutical companies have been downgraded for the last 15 years pretty regularly, simply because of litigation risk. This is, everyone likes to think it's a nice, safe industry. It's not. So the task here, really, as an analyst, for me and for our portfolio manager, is to say, take what these risks are and try to figure out what the economic impacts of them materializing actually is. Because that's when I'll be able to map them onto my financial risk model of the company. Because my financial risk model of the company is going to be, I have certain expectations about it maintaining credit ratios within certain bounds over a period of time. What's going to disturb that materially? And from a rating agency perspective, what's going to disturb it material enough to produce a downgrade? So in the case of environmental issues here, we've got, the economic impacts range from reputational risk and license to operate. The Barrick Gold example we heard about this morning, actually at lunchtime I discovered this article from Buenos Aires about Barrick Gold now admitting that the cyanide spill in some river in Argentina was actually 5 times larger than they initially indicated that it was. We've got a management issue here, clearly. Regulatory compliance costs are starting to become embedded here. Possible loss of business and asset impairment. Now, I need to be careful here on asset impairment because assets get impaired all the time, and I think I'm trying to be very cautious on using the term stranded assets as opposed to asset impairment or just asset declines, because assets decline all the time. Stranded assets imply that there's still an economic life to that asset, but in fact, a lot of what, some of the examples that I'm going to be talking about, it's borderline whether or not that's really the case. So anyway, the point is that once I've identified some of the economic costs associated with these issues, I can then map them onto particularly operating margins, particularly in terms of potential liability provisions, and whether or not there's going to be any asset impairments. That's what's going to tell me whether or not I'm running any particular downgrade risks or not. And actually, it turns out that for social and governance, the process is pretty much exactly the same. Climate risks. What does that look like? Well, from sheer lack of initiative, I broke that down into mitigation risks and adaptation risks. Carbon pricing is still a major risk. I've sort of given up on the notion of us ever really getting a real carbon price. But if we did, it's clearly going to be significant for a number of industries, particularly in terms of energy costs. Other carbon risks, extraction costs have been going through the roof. Mention was made yesterday, I forgot by whom, but of the recent Wood Mackenzie report that has identified $1.5 trillion of CapEx projects that should not proceed. These are big projects. These are like what's going on in northern Canada. This is like offshore stuff. And McKinsey's actually been tracking this for a number of years, and the size of E&P projects in the fossil fuel industry, and it's been, your average project now is, double-digit billions. That's the kind of stuff that's getting canceled now. We've got other mitigation costs. Adaptation risks are actually, as time goes on, we'll be moving more and more over to the right, I suspect here. But this is really things like, what do we do about stuff on coasts and rivers? And the way we've been dealing with it up to now is by ignoring it, but eventually we'll have to start dealing with it in terms of insurance and taxes and regulatory costs. Event risks like Sandy and Ebola. Societal risks, there's no line there. But probably a good example of that is the impact of a 3-year drought in Syria 7 years later, which is what we're seeing now. And whether or not we'll see more of those things in the future, which I suspect sadly we will. So again, the deal is we can come up with the economic impacts and map them onto, again, our boilerplate candidates of operating costs and margins, potential asset impairments. I probably should have included potential litigation reserve here, but it's hard to see them arising.
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. Finally, natural capital risk. It's sort of a new category because the concept of natural capital is relatively recent. But it's actually a very useful one because it captures a lot of stuff. In particular, it captures, for example, the kind of stuff that Kate was talking about this morning with water scarcity. Water scarcity is a huge issue, and we are seeing it affect the mining industry. In fact, the agencies have all put out, both Moody's and S&P, have put out pieces on potential water impacts on the mining industry and the fact that these are clearly not going to be positive for ratings, they're going to be negative. We've got the fossil fuel depletion. I'm trying to avoid fossil fuel discussions because we've kind of been wallowing in it. Then we got renewable and non-renewable resources. I just sort of call your attention to the fact that McKinsey has actually been doing yeoman work the last couple of years on commodities. And in spite of a lot of softness in a lot of commodities right now, the long-term trends are for steadily increasing commodity prices over time, even with no global warming kind of adjustments. And factoring on a change in carbon pricing on top of that is just blows everything up. At 150 years of cheap energy, there's no way that continues, unless it does politically. which is sort of the problem. Again, so what else we got here? We got geopolitical event risks, rare earth minerals, the whole hula on that over a couple of years ago. You'll remember everything's in China. Well, it isn't really. But we do have this interesting situation with phosphorus, phosphate fertilizers, integral to the modern agricultural system. 70–80% of known phosphorus resources are in Morocco. Most of the rest are in places like Egypt. Is this an issue? We'll see. We got political instability, global warming impacts. This is not, I've sort of put this in here because it's the kind of, here's where I'm thinking we're going to see impacts in terms on forests and agriculture and fisheries in particular from the longer term impacts. Now, is this a stranded asset issue? Probably not, but it's an issue. And then we have subsidy risks, and I was very pleased to hear the subsidy discussions so far, because this is huge. And it actually makes sense to think that more would be accomplished by eliminating subsidies and making economic costs closer to what they really are than anything else we could do. How likely that is an open question. So anyway, it's the same drill here, and we can again come down with some assessments on whether or not this is going to have any real impact on credit ratings or not. So far it has, but only in very limited cases. Water industry, coal industry, metals and mining, we're starting to see it. Over the longer term, I suspect we'll see more. So,
2 minutes.
yeah, okay. So where do stranded assets come from, though? Where are we likely to find stranded assets emerging? Well, regulatory risk is a real one. I mean, the coal industry, this is regulatory risk. Now, shouldn't have been unanticipated, but regulatory risk is going to be with us for a long time. Carbon pricing risk may or may not materialize. If it does, there's a whole bunch of industries I can think of, starting with airlines, maritime transportation, the cement industry, the list goes on, where the cost dynamic changes radically. Adaptation risk. My favorite example here is railroads, and I've got a slide that shows this. So actually, I'll hold off on that for a second. Depletion risk. Water depletion is an issue, but it's not the only thing that's being depleted. We are seeing a lot of non-ferrous, a lot of metals depletion going on, and our time frame here is longer, of course. I mean, we're talking a couple of decades, but and I'll be retired. But these are real risks. The global warming impact on natural resources. Again, I'm not sure I would say this is a stranded asset, but it is certainly something where we're seeing asset values getting affected. And subsidy loss risk, which is a political issue entirely, and whether or not that ever materializes, I hope it does. Actually, we'll see. Now, how does this work in practice? Just very briefly, one of the claims I would not make about this approach is that it's elegant, because what I've done here is I've looked at transportation, airlines, the marine transport industry, and rail operators. In terms of these various categories, and just sort of broken things down, and just basically to cut to the chase here, stranded asset risks. Okay, airlines probably low. This is counterintuitive, but what assets do airlines own? Well, they actually don't have all that many assets. They often don't own their fleets. They're owned by ILFC or GE or something like that. They may own their slots at the airport, but they probably don't own the airports. So that, and they've got reputation. So, where do stranded asset risks arise here? Well, they don't. Marine transport, I enjoyed the paper this morning. I guess I'm a little bit less anxious about it, mainly because the companies that I follow are generally the larger ones who are well capitalized and have newer fleets. And ports actually appear to be the major candidate here. But ports are generally not owned by the freight transporters. They're generally owned by municipalities or port companies. So railroads. Now this is the interesting one because on the one hand, this is everyone's favorite mode of transport. It's the most efficient way to move stuff around, clearly. Problem is, a lot of railroads are right there on the water. I gave a similar presentation to this last March in Washington DC, and I was traveling down from Boston, so I took the train. You know, and for at least half the trip, you look at that, there's the water, right? It's right there. You know, and you know, the UK, you got a similar situation. I can't imagine, you know, there aren't other situations like that. You know, which raises the question: what do you do if you have to move a railroad? You know, moving an airport, you know, Logan Airport, which I fly in and out of all the time in Boston. You know, if they have to move that, well, that's easy. You know, they just move it higher ground, inland somewhere. You know, what do you do if you have to move a railroad? You know, the scale of this is daunting. So now, is this really a stranded asset issue, or well, it depends on whether or not those assets are still in the books. But it's just such a great problem to think about that I just felt I would mention it. So that's pretty much it. I'm done. Thank you.